Think about where we were a year ago. The backdrop for this issue, we had a lot of emotion and a lot of media coverage, very hostile media coverage, wondering if agriculture and horticulture were killing the bees. And part of that backdrop, too, had been a very terrible situation in a Target parking lot in Wilsonville, Oregon, where a very unwise landscape application of a neonic to actively flowering linden trees that were being actively visited by scores of bumblebees caused the death of about 50,000, they say, bumblebees. And this happened right down the street from Xerces, an organization that is very much engaged in protecting invertebrates generally and pollinators specifically. So worst case scenario, and whether we like it or not, horticulture found itself in the center of this debate. Now the good news is, if you look at the comprehensive health assessments that have been done around the world in places like the US, our USDA's counterparts in nations like the United Kingdom, England, and Australia, what you find is that these health assessments do not point to neonics specifically or pesticides generally as the primary cause of threats to bee health. And bear in mind, we're talking about more than just honeybees here. We're also talking about various native bees, butterflies and other types of pollinators, but honeybees have very much been at the center of the public consciousness on this debate. So again, the good news is that these reports show what we have come to understand, which is there are many threats to bee health. And of those, the single biggest threat would be parasites and the diseases that they vector. But beekeeping practices themselves, commercial beekeeping practices, loss of habitat and forage, various other problems, all contribute to the threats that bees face. This is the varroa mite, which is, beekeepers will tell you this is the big threat. This is the single biggest threat that they deal with in terms of maintaining the health of their honeybees. But how we organize our landscapes, both on the agricultural side as well as on the urban side, contributes to the loss of forage and habitat. Major issue for us that is a common ground concern where we can work with partners that may have a different ultimate agenda in some respects than we do. And we often say denial is not a river in Egypt, and denial is not a strategy for managing this issue. We need to understand that pesticides, insecticides are designed to kill insects, and bees and these other pollinators are largely insects, and so we have to be mindful of how our practices intersect with the concerns. So this is unlike many issues we deal with, because normally we're dealing with Congress and we're dealing with the federal agencies, and in this case, Congress is pretty much a non-event. We're not going to see much coming out of Congress on this issue other than maybe some additional research funding and resources. EPA is not our primary problem at this point. EPA so far has seemed to walk a line of commitment to following the science, which is a commitment we share. If the science informs us in ways that are negative, we're going to have to adjust accordingly. But EPA is so far following the science, largely. We're also concerned about states and municipalities, other more local jurisdictions doing hasty things when driven by activists, and these hasty decisions can be very, very disruptive. We've won a few of those local battles, and we've lost a few of those local battles. And then, of course, the ultimate worry for us is that the mass retail formats decide our fate in an emotion-driven way rather than in a science-driven way. And some might be cynical and figure that's already happened. I'm not convinced that the story's over on that when you look at the responses so far of the mass retail formats. We're finding ourselves working with these mass retail formats in different ways. I mean, bear in mind that AmericanHort is the largest independent garden center organization in North America. And the independents, there's a risk that they get a little bit confused. Why are we talking to Home Depot? We don't want Home Depot or Lowe's or any of the other mass formats to decide our fate. We want to be able to manage our fate. The evolving federal picture, just very briefly, in EPA, there's a lot going on at EPA. First of all, we do have concerns as EPA is developing and implementing additional label guidance. We do have concerns that label guidance could be overreaching at times, so we're watching that closely. There is an active comment period right now on an EPA proposal to mitigate bee exposure to acutely toxic pesticides. Now this is mostly in the context of protecting bees for commercial pollination services. And so we're not convinced that the impact on our industry of this particular activity is going to be terribly great. However, it's a very complicated proposal and all the stakeholders are working through it. We joined with the American Honey Producers Association to seek further time because we just want to make sure we fully understand what the implications may be and how we work with this. And then more broadly than EPA, I think everybody knows there is a national strategy that has been backed by the White House. It involves many departments and federal agencies. Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, and many agencies, EPA certainly involved. But the important point I want to make for you today is this is no longer about just neonics. This is a much broader situation. We are looking at new data requirements coming from EPA over a period of the next several years for 76 insecticide, fungicide, and herbicide active ingredients. Going to be very complicated because in many cases, EPA is concerned about synergistic effects. And so a concern for us is, do the data development requirements sort of recreate the minor use crisis that we dealt with some years ago, where we were concerned that manufacturers didn't have enough reason to invest in the data required to sustain uses in our markets. And we may see that play out on a more pollinator-specific scale here. So again, this is no longer just about neonics. So the initiative, and I'm going to get in the back end of the presentation, as Laura said, I'll get a little bit more into what we're doing here. But just to give you an overview of the Horticulture Industry Bee and Pollinator Stewardship Initiative, we have three primary goals. Goal number one is to fund and direct research, because we know we need better answers. We have some information and we need better information, and we're going to need to follow the science. Two, we are working to implement a stewardship program for growers, for plant producers, so that when the question can be reframed from yes or no to here's what we're doing. And then thirdly, we're looking to partner with groups that share a common interest in expanding forage and habitat. And there are a lot of mainstream groups working in this space who are willing to set aside policy debates where we may have disagreements to work together toward improving habitat and forage. On the research front, HRI has funded 5 projects worth a total of about $160,100 to be precise. As was mentioned, American Floral Endowment has funded a 6th project down at Clemson University, which Terrell is in the details on. We've also managed to leverage. One of the projects we funded, $25,000, which allowed us to show to USDA that we had skin in the game. We leveraged an additional $272,000 through a Farm Bill grant. And all of us are working together, many of you in this room, to advise a consortium or a collaboration of scientists who are seeking a specialty crop research initiative grant. We get this, it could be as big as about $7 million in research funding over a period of years. And this project, if it gets funded, may be our key to providing EPA the data that EPA needs and not falling through the cracks as an industry. I'm not going to go into detail on these projects, the 5 HRI funded projects. The lead one is Richard Coles at the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station, who is just a tremendous researcher in this space. But the common denominator, these projects are looking at residues and toxicity. They're looking at bee attractiveness of things we grow. They're looking at the opportunity side, that we're part of the solution. They're looking at best management practices and fates of substrate-applied neonics. So we've worked with a public relations company to sort of figure out what do we call this initiative, and the GrowWise Be Smart is what emerged from sort of a careful consideration of the different options, and you can see the graphic of how the GrowWise Be Smart logo was ultimately built out. But with respect to stewardship and our progress on this initiative, I want to emphasize, first of all, we have launched the growwise.org website, which is going to be the hub for our activities going forward. Lots of information there already, but there will be more as research results come in, more guidance and so forth that happens there. We have developed a technical framework. We've had a task force of industry members, including some folks in this room, and some science advisors who have taken a look at the basic framework. And there are 2 parts to it. One is sort of the plant production component, which is, really when you think about it, we're looking at 2 factors. On one hand, how is the plant ultimately going to be used, and is it bee attractive? And on the other hand, the timing considerations that need to come into play with respect to the use of certain crop protection agents. So the technical framework has been developed, and there is also a habitat and forage component. And this has been a very interesting conversation. I have to tell you, there have been growers who have pushed back against this in the conversation initially. But as we have networked with a bigger and bigger circle of players, this has remained a very important thing. And so what we mean by that is that a participating grower will either on their own property have to support habitat and forage for pollinators, or they'll have to financially support in a reasonable way third parties who are engaged in that process in their local area. And the habitat and forage component, I think there are lots of good opportunities for synergy here with respect to what we've heard about beneficials. In terms of partnerships, on the broader level of improving the habitat and forage situation for pollinators in a mega way, AmericanHort was one of 8 founding partners that came together to form the National Pollinator Garden Network. Those 8 partners existed sort of across the conservation and gardening space, both public and private. So they include, on one end of the spectrum, the National Wildlife Federation, and on the other end of the spectrum, 2 trade associations, AmericanHort and American Seed Trade Association, as well as many of the other gardening, like American Public Gardens Association. And these groups together, who have been joined by many others, I think the network is now in excess of 30 groups, we've launched this thing called the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge. So the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge has an aspirational and hopefully real goal of seeing individuals take action to establish 1 million new pollinator gardens between now and the end of 2016 on any scale. A window box, a patio planter, a little bit of a shrub border, or a true landscape scale habitat. And from our perspective, this is a tremendous opportunity for our industry to be the source for plants and for expertise. I want to tell you, I was just out, I've been talking a lot with the network of consultants who advise our independent garden retail establishments, our members in that space. And I asked one of them, what do retailers most need in this space? The answer was they need role models. The folks who are doing it well, we need to uphold those examples. It just so happened I was out on Wednesday this past week at Greenscape Gardens in St. Louis, Missouri. And Greenscape is an example of a company that wholly embraced the opportunity. And it's not just about monarchs, but their sales of pollinator supporting native plants rose by over 100%. This particular spring, even though they had a pretty bad spring. So very, very exciting opportunity at retail to pull customers in and to get customers hooked. And to get younger customers who are viewing what we do differently than older customers involved and hooked. So that's a high-level overview of what we're up to. There are 2 ways that you can help in this process. One of them is by financially supporting the work. There are a handful of industry leaders who have supported this work and made it possible, the research agenda and the stewardship program and the partnerships. And some of those have provided 5 and even 6 figures of funding to help move this initiative forward. I would strongly suggest, if you're interested in knowing more, talk to me, talk to somebody like Gary Mangum at Bell Nursery, who's been a major leader in this effort. And then secondly, embrace the goals and the message of the Grow Wise Be Smart program as we roll it out, as well as the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge. We see this as a tremendous opportunity for the industry and one that is very, very timely as we attempt to keep a retain a position where growers have the most possible options with respect to how they can safely and wisely manage pests, and our industry can claim its rightful place as part of the solution.